Good morning, church. I pray you're all keeping well. I continue to miss meeting up with you all at this time, but I am very grateful that we can connect some through social media and that, and through little video chats. And I guess at this time, a lot of you are very busy, extra busy probably. You've got kids at home, you've got extra homework now to do, you're into the homeschooling thing, and on top of everything else, and maybe at this time things can be very busy, but for maybe others you're there, and this season really means a lot more isolation than normal, and there's been a lot of curtailing of your normal activities, and I've just been thinking about that some over this last while, and thinking about what is God doing in the midst of all this and in our lives and that. And I've been conscious, a couple of you shared that verse, Philippians 2:13 recently, and Philippians 2:13 says, "For it's God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure." And I was reminded that God is always working in us for his pleasure. God is always doing something in the midst of things. And today I'd just like you to take a moment, first of all, take a moment and consider what God might be doing in the midst of this. And it's very interesting, that verse really is sandwiched in the middle of a chapter really is dealing, I suppose, with character. And Paul is, in Philippians, he's addressing, in chapter 2, he's addressing that we should be more like Jesus. And I suppose follow his example. And we know the character of Christ, who laid aside the glory, he humbled himself, became like a bondservant, and really came for us. And we see that in the first part of the chapter. But then the second part of the chapter, Paul goes on, and I want us to think about particularly verses 17 to 30 of Philippians chapter 2. And there, Paul addresses two people, two individuals. One is Timothy, and the other is Epaphroditus. And Timothy tells the Philippians that he longs to send Timothy to them. And he says this, in verse 19, "For I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state." And he goes on now to talk about Timothy, because he says something here. He says, "For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state." I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. So in other words, he's saying that Timothy will sincerely care for their state. And I thought, isn't that a lovely thing? It talks about the character of this guy Timothy. Paul has spent a lot of time with him, Timothy, and he's assured that Timothy will genuinely care for their state. Timothy has a like a shepherd's heart, someone who really, like a pastor's heart. He cares for people. And he also goes on there to say in verse 22, "But you know Timothy's character, that as a son with his father he served with me in the gospel. Therefore I hope to send him to you soon." So Timothy, he, as a son, they sort of had the son-father relationship there. Timothy just came, he humbled himself, he was faithful to Paul, and he submitted himself to Paul and served alongside Paul. It's such a lovely thing. It really speaks of his character, doesn't it? It speaks of that he was humble, it speaks of he was submitted, speaks that he was faithful. And earlier in verse 19 we were reading there that, or verse 20, that Timothy would sincerely care for them. So he had that pastoral, that shepherd's heart. It says a lot about Timothy's character, doesn't it? And then Paul goes on to mention Epaphroditus. Now Epaphroditus was somebody that the Philippians had sent to Paul with a gift for Paul. And while there, Epaphroditus became very sick, even to the point of death nearly, but he's recovered now, and Paul's sending him back. And listen what he says about Epaphroditus. Verse 25, he describes Epaphroditus and he says, "My brother, my fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger, the one who ministered to my need." So Epaphroditus, Paul having spent some time with Epaphroditus, he describes him as a brother, he describes him as a co-worker, a fellow worker, and a fellow soldier. Amazing, isn't it? We think of like somebody who's a brother, who's a faithful brother, just a friend who's there through the good times and the bad times. And again, somebody who cares, sincerely cares. A brother. He's also a co-worker. Now, Paul was involved in ministry. Paul was, he was planting churches. He was ministering. His heart was to share the gospel. And he talked that Epaphroditus came, and he now describes him as a co-worker, someone who was serving with Paul in whatever capacity was open to him at that time. Whether it was just ministering directly to Paul, but encouraging him, not only with the gift that he brought, but I'm sure he was encouraging him in the word, so much so that Paul could see that. He was a co-worker. So obviously he was sharing to people as well. He was sharing the good news of the gospel. It's lovely. And then Paul also says he was a fellow soldier. And, you know, we know through Paul in his ministry years and that he really understood this, that really that there's a battle, a spiritual battle as well in sharing the gospel. And we battle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers and that. And so Epaphroditus, he tells us, was a fellow soldier, someone who was able to pray and battle, pray for souls, pray for breakthrough, pray for just the spiritual realms to be changed. And just lovely. So when we think of these two individuals that Paul brings up in the latter part of Philippians chapter 2, Timothy, we see him there that, you know, Timothy sincerely cared for people. Timothy was submitted. Timothy was humble. Timothy was faithful. We see Epaphroditus. He was a brother, a fellow brother. He was a co-worker. He was a fellow soldier. All these things, it deals with, he's talking about character. And so I want to encourage us today that in this time, maybe what God is allowing us to do is to, I suppose, reevaluate and have a reboot maybe. Is God doing something like that in our hearts, that we would be faithful, that we would be humble and submitted, that we would care for one another, taking that opportunity to encourage one another, that we would be considered a fellow brother or a fellow sister, that we would be a co-worker. We see ourselves as co-workers in the gospel, doing what we can do, whether it is praying, whether it is giving, whether it is encouraging, phoning, encouraging, sending a card to someone at this time. And just understand there, and also a fellow soldier, that we really would take our positions and pray for one another at this time. Just pray, lift each other's needs before the Lord at this stage. And let's press into all that God is doing, because God is doing something. Earlier we read that verse, there's God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So what's the Lord doing in you this week? May you be blessed as you push into God this week. May he enrich you. May he give you great times of encouragement with him. And I love you all, and hopefully we'll see you soon. God bless you, and have a great day.